Chapter 101 Well-Made Plans. Chris. Point of view. Jonathan, Austin, and I stood front and center against the thralls exiting the gate with the rest of the warriors either next to us or behind us. Due to the sheer amount of thralls in the camp, there were still groups of them inside the walls trying to squeeze through the gate. The trebuchets and artillery mage kept up their fire even as the minions closed in since there were so many to target. Giant explosions from traps and electrical implosions sounded out as the minions walked through the traps we had set. We were told electricity was their weakness and we used that to our advantage. Most of the traps we brought with us were essentially EMPs. The electrical explosions were the best bang for our buck regarding effectiveness against the thralls. It zapped the control out of them and made them stand still without any orders for them to act on. Damien had gone into extensive length about the effects lightning had on them. He was enthusiastic about his affinity. Anything about lightning had the guy talking for hours. He did have useful information and we put that to good use. We took every scrap of information we could to use it to our advantage. But that was before. The plan was made and already in motion and there were no more plans to be had, no more that I had to worry about. My job was to fight and to fight well. So that was what I did. All my skills came alive and billowed out of me, sapping the heat from the air. I stood ahead of the rest to keep the effects focused on my enemies. Austin was off to my left and Jonathan was to my right doing the same. Our three best fighters would be the tidebreakers while the rest stood behind us ready to catch the overflow. I didn't intend for there to be any overflow. Permafrost, hail, sea, and ice manipulation, were already in motion and my hammer started singing. Even though these were merely thralls, I wouldn't take them lightly. As permafrost, drained my mana to deepen the effects, glacial presence, started increasing my abilities, the temperature dropping enough to activate the skill. All of it added together to have me smashing heads as quickly as I could. The thralls were weak but numerous and my sweeping hammer swings took multiple down at once. Austin's light beams were being shot off from over on his side, but I couldn't see what Jonathan was doing. His skills didn't have the same flair as Austin's or the impact that mine did. With the mass of bodies rushing toward us, I treated it as yet another wave. I was good at fighting waves. The mindbreaker, Craig, point of view. Sweat ran down his brow as he sat and stared out the window. Fires raged around him, but the stone keep where he resided was immune to the flame, making the heat merely an annoyance. All of it had been going to shit lately and it was only getting worse. He had been caught unprepared for the attack and he was so flustered he failed to respond quickly enough. The attack on his capital had been unexpected. He thought only an idiot would attack him, and if they did, it surely wouldn't be so soon. He was wrong. Only a fool would attack his capital, and when he saw who it was he couldn't help but sneer. 30 people, if that. Barely a handful had come and they thought they were going to defeat him. Him. And it was the one who had chased him. Oh, he was looking forward to what was coming. He wasn't the same person he was a few weeks ago and he had made a breakthrough. He had yet to test his new skills fully, but these people were the perfect guinea pigs. He had been building up an army for nearly 3 months, and if these people thought that he would go down easily, they were wrong. Craig wasn't stupid, and he had made up for his mistake earlier. Numbers weren't everything, and he had been made aware of that fact, and it was time to show these people their folly. His camp was at the corner of the tutorial. The corner. He had ready access to strong monsters to dominate, and he had done so without rest. He was building up a force to wipe through all the survivors of the tutorial, and these people only brought 30. He raised his hands and started to conduct. A phantom song in his head took the lead, and his orchestra rushed to follow his cues. His army wasn't as weak as they thought it was, and he couldn't wait to see his song come to fruition. He didn't want to miss this. Abigail. Point of view. Everything was going smoothly so far, and that made her nervous. The plan was being executed, and there was nothing for her to do. No one needed healing, and everyone was where they should be. There was nothing left to plan, and no one left to direct. Everyone was already doing their part in the battle, some more than others. A 20-meter area of frost bloomed into being ahead of the warriors, and bodies flew every which way out of it. Crushed and mutilated bodies littered the area, and she couldn't help but think Chris was taking this seriously. They had cards they could still play if things went sideways, but something about the whole situation was bugging her. Abigail knew that it shouldn't be this easy. They were at the man's doorstep decimating his army. Something should be going wrong. Whether it was fate or coincidence, Kathy suddenly tensed beside Abigail before stuttering over words, trying to get them out too quickly. There's more that were outside the camp. A whole horde of them are coming from the north, she shouted out. Abigail unrolled a map of the area to have Kathy point out where the new threat was coming from, and the woman quickly did. Seeing their direction, they would have to split up to face them. Abigail was just about to rearrange everyone when Kathy's sudden intake of breath stopped her. There's more. The scene repeated, and Abigail was confronted with a grim scene. They had severely underestimated the mindbreaker and did not have a full accounting of their numbers. 3 arrows represented the forces that were charging toward them. The monsters hidden in the north coming down, thralls escaping the southern gate of the camp coming from the northeast, and this new force coming from the east. This fight was about to get dicey. Kathy. Point of view. Kathy wasn't prepared for the images she was seeing through her birds. They were going to be overwhelmed. The thought of running away was hard to ignore, and she had to fight her natural reaction to what she was seeing. The thralls she had scouted in the camp weren't even half of it. The mindbreaker had pulled more out of nowhere, and there were countless closing in on them. She was still trying to get a good count as they closed in from outside the tutorial bounds. The numbers kept climbing, and the longer it took to get an estimate, the dimmer their outcome looked. The whole time, she hurried to explain what she was seeing to the others and mark on the map where the new force was coming from. The information was disseminated among the fighters, and everyone was made aware of the new threat. Kathy couldn't keep up with all of the changes she was seeing, but she was trying her best. Things were constantly being added, and the people started talking over each other, coming up with ideas on how to deal with it. Even while the fight with the leading thralls raged, more were making their way toward the fight. What was a trickle of enemies now was about to become a tsunami. Before she could say anything else, she felt a disturbance through her birds and watched as 4 figures concealed in shadows appeared in their ranks. The 4 shadows appeared right behind the strongest members of their forces. Right behind Jonathan's stone-clad form, Austin, Rachel, and Christopher's ice-covered back. Kathy didn't even get a chance to say anything before the figures attacked and daggers plunged down on their targets. Gasps of surprise and cries of pain sounded out, and Rachel disappeared in a burst of fire, reappearing a few feet away with a dagger in her back, barely missing her heart. Rogues! Austin was quick enough to dodge the fatal blow, but the dagger scored a deep cut through his side, parting his armor with ease. Jonathan and Chris were both unprepared for the surprise attack and took the full brunt of it, both of their elemental armors parting before the blades. Enchantments on the weapons flashed, and Kathy saw through her birds as blood was drawn from both of the mighty tanks she thought invulnerable. Mass panic sounded out from the surprise, and Kathy heard a skill being shouted from somewhere. She wasn't certain who. Revealing light. The shadows around the figures were burned away and revealed their full forms to everyone. After the light illuminated the area, the figures were swiftly killed in retaliation. They fell easily to attacks and didn't seem to have any defensive skills, only proficient in stealth and assassination. What was that? Were those assassins? Speculation and thoughts ran wild, and even the swift retaliation didn't calm people's nerves. This was the first time any of them had dealt with an assassination attempt. None of the monsters during the waves were stealth experts, and this was the first time seeing something like this for many. All the rogues they knew strayed away from the stealth and assassination route and went a different direction with their class. It seemed that some didn't follow that sentiment and were now assassins in the Mindbreaker's army. Just when it couldn't get worse, they had to worry about being stabbed in the back. Worry spread through the ranks like wildfire. They were beset by countless monsters, and assassins just attempted to take out their strongest. Cries of pain sounded out after the attack. Rachel had a gaping wound on her side that healers rushed to attend to. The other 3 weren't as lucky. They were on the front lines fighting. Healers couldn't go out there safely to heal them. Some ranged heals fell on them, but from the severity of the wounds, not much was healed. Chris and Jonathan still hadn't taken the daggers out. Abigail had to be held back from going to heal her husband from the dagger that was still in his back. New battle lines were set up and people prepared for the new threat revealed to them. Shouting and explosions sounded out, making giving orders all the harder. Shit was hitting the fan, and it was hitting it fast. "Austin, you take the north." Kathy heard Chris yell out. "Jonathan, take the east. I need healing." Jonathan yelled back. "Retreat to the healers. I can hold them until you get back," Chris answered. Austin moved to cover his new direction while Jonathan made a fighting retreat to the healers. The frozen circle grew to accommodate their moving and covered the spot that was left vacant, extending to nearly 2/3 of the battlefront. Blades and chunks of ice whistled through the air, holding off the majority of the monsters. Nothing was said, but Kathy could see the knife sticking out of the ice armor that encapsulated him. She knew where it was plunged, and it was right in the middle. There was no chance that it missed the heart, or if it had, it hit something else important. Jonathan got in range of her normal hearing, not her birds, and she saw as the healers started fussing over him. They pulled the knife out of his back, and all three layered healing skills onto the wound. "How did it get through?" Jonathan asked. He seemed bewildered. Something was able to penetrate his armor. "The knife has enchantments on it, but I can't tell what it does." Chris would know, but we can't go and ask him. "They must have used some armor-penetrating skill or something." Abigail answered with the dagger in her hand. "We need to be prepared for it to happen again. I doubt those are the only rogues he has in his army." Sam, the other healer, said, "What are we going to do? We will be overwhelmed at this rate." Jonathan said, "We have our contingency plans to fall back on, and we still have the extra consumables we can use. If we fall back, we might be able to hold out." Abigail muttered, trying to figure out the best course of action. All the while, the monsters threw themselves at the front line, and the reinforcements charging at them were about to get here. It's not perfect, but it will do for now. We can't waste any more time. The monsters are almost here," Sam said, cutting off her healing skill, the green glow diminishing. Jonathan got up and ran off to the east, where the new enemies were about to hit them from. From the bird she had kept near Christopher, just in case he shouted something important, Kathy heard something she didn't think was meant for her. "Austin. Yeah. I need you to keep them safe. Run if you have to, but I need you to promise me." "What? What are you on about?" "Promise me." "All right. I promise to keep them safe." Kathy had a feeling Chris was about to do something stupid. Chapter 102, Wrong Words. Chris. Point of view. "Fuck. This hurts." I felt the knife in my back dig deeper every time I moved to swing my hammer or dodge a blow. Every twist of my torso aggravated it further. Assassins weren't something I had anticipated, and that failure was biting me in the ass. Rogue was one of the 5 main classes, and dismissing the possibility of assassins was a rookie mistake. It went to show how inexperienced we were at planning for war. We were lucky none of us had died from the attack. Jonathan and I were the worst off, and he was already healed. Frozen patchwork was keeping me going. The dagger nicked something important in my chest cavity, but I had no idea what. I was no doctor and could only guess at what had happened. The chill from the skill numbed most of the pain and worked to curtail the bleeding. It wasn't meant for important organs, but I infused my law into the skill to boost its strength. We had severely underestimated our foe. I thought that his army would be weakened slightly from the battles he put them through, but we were wrong. The things I heard relayed to me from Kathy painted a grim picture. We still had aces up our sleeves, but I wasn't sure it would be enough anymore. Already people were retreating to the second line of stone fortifications we had built. The only way I thought to end it was to kill the one controlling them. It wasn't guaranteed to stop the horde of monsters from attacking, but it would certainly weaken them. So I was going to do something stupid, like entering the lion's den alone. I had fought an entire wave alone. I could take out one man. Making Austin promise to take care of them was probably unnecessary, but it gave me peace of mind. I didn't think that he wouldn't, but on the off chance things went poorly, I needed to be sure. After my decision was made, I began my march, wading through the flowing thralls and against the current of their bodies. I marched into the belly of the beast, leaving as I had left an opening in the front line, but the amount I was killing more than made up for it. The closer I got to the gate, The more pressure was applied to stop me and the more bodies found themselves deformed. Their resistance was futile and their efforts were in vain. It didn't work. I faced heavy resistance trying to enter the gate, but it was nothing my hammer couldn't smash aside. I didn't even have to call on my bloodline to get through and was able to keep it in reserve for later. I flattened the horde of thralls as I walked over them to enter the castle. They were even nice enough to hold the gates open for me. Immediately, I felt the blazing heat from the fires in the camp, and I had to work overtime to fight the hostile mana in the area. It was nothing compared to Rachel's skill with flames, and it was easily dealt with. The fires had no will of their own to give them strength, no one to fight me for control. Where I walked, fires sputtered and went out before frosting over. There would be none of that near me. My target was the only building still standing, the keep. Trying to conserve my mana was hard with all of the bodies surrounding me, and at certain points, massive expenditures were necessary. A giant ice fortress, combined with shatter, opened up holes in the bodies, giving me one more step toward the keep. This was the first time I was fighting to get somewhere rather than hold somewhere, and the difficulty was much different. It was a lot easier to hold an area against a force than it was to get to an area through a force. Even so, my hammer swung ferociously and I made my way toward the keep. While fighting to get here, I had been trying to come up with ideas on how to get into the keep. If the doors were barred and defended well enough, I would have trouble getting in. It wouldn't be a problem if I wasn't so pressed for time. I would eventually be able to get through, at least I thought I could. But the longer I took killing the Mindbreaker, the longer my family had to fight off the monsters he controlled. That all changed when I saw the crowd of thralls part before a middle-aged man. Something about his face tugged at my memory, but I couldn't place it. He didn't have the same listless expression as all the others, and the army around him gave a wide berth. Like they weren't allowed to get any closer. This was him. The man who had caused so many troubles for me. The one who attacked my family and sought to turn them into their will usurped and their body's puppet. Just seeing him made me angry. It was an unexpected boon that the man himself appeared before me, and it was one I would capitalize on. I didn't care to examine him closely or note down his features. They would be smashed into oblivion soon, and it wouldn't matter. His body would be unrecognizable after I was done with it. With the parting of bodies, I launched myself at him, reading my hammer. Well, Helldash, both Frostbite and Mighty Blow are slotted onto it, and I brought it down as hard as I could, not giving him a chance to speak. Clang. The sound of metal meeting something hard rang out, and it wasn't the dull thud of my hammer hitting flesh. Did you really think that would work? The man said from behind a massive metallic ant that blocked my blow. An ant that was in my recent memory, and not for good reasons. It was the ant boss from the last wave, and it fully absorbed my blow without showing any signs of wear. Shit. As the words flowed out of his mouth, I felt an influence settle over my mind. It was looking for a way to control me. Wisps of fog surrounding and threatening to come in. I had activated mental walls, the second I got into the camp, but I double-checked it was active for good measure. The skill worked to rebuff the influence, and I saw the man grimace at his failure. It seems you'll be a difficult one, he added, but otherwise looked unperturbed. I held zero intentions of holding a conversation, and even less for holding a conversation with a mind manipulator. My best course of action was to kill him where he stood, and to do that, I had to get through the Ant Queen. Oh, I can tell this will be fun. You fighting to kill me while the rest of your family dies, and I get to slowly pick your mind apart. What was your goal, I wonder? Did you think you could win? His words couldn't be tuned out. It was like they were burrowing into my ears, forcing me to listen to his monologue. There was no reason to hold back any longer, and I activated everything I had. Momentum of the Avalanche was already going at full blast, and Barbarian's Fury boosted my stats further. I called on the power of my bloodline, and I felt the cold spread from my core into every inch of my body. Strength flowed through me, and my ice felt smoother. Permafrost worked to chill the area even faster, and as more frost built up and the air dropped below zero, Glacial Presence boosted my stats even further. I see you intend to fight anyway. I leaned on the fury coursing through me, and the words finally got out of my head. The man seemed to be doing something, but I threw myself at the ant queen to kill it quickly. It was blocking my way to my real target. I had already killed it once, I would do so again. Smashing it around with my hammer, while cathartic, didn't go as well this time around. Other monsters were hampering me and clawing at me, and one giant one made itself known entering the battle. Roar! A massive vine bear charged at me from behind and knocked me to the ground while I was swinging at the ant queen. The attack pushed the knife lodged in my back deeper in, and it hindered my movement even more than it already was. I felt it intimately as it pushed deeper in. The pain was excruciating, but I pushed it out of my mind. I had a mission to complete, and a little pain wasn't going to stop me from that. Turning to look around me, I watched as previous bosses made themselves known, and for the first time in a long time, I felt despair. I felt the presence of one of them before I saw it. My control over my ice began to waver, and something was fighting back against it. It was nowhere near Rachel's level, but it was an annoyance I didn't need right now, facing down 3 massive bosses. The massive vine bear, roaring and pawing at the ground. The metal ant queen with metal pincers that could chomp through my armor. And the burning blaze lion to mitigate some of my ice. 3 of the hardest bosses that I had fought recently. Something told me that wasn't a coincidence. If he had these bosses, he most likely had others, and my mind had no trouble coming up with where they might be. It would seem he held these 3 back specifically for me. How much of what happened was his plan? Did he know we were coming to attack? Did he know I would charge in alone if I felt it was necessary? Did he plan this? The despair I felt only grew as my speculations continued. Something was nudging my mind along that line of thought, but I couldn't feel it. If even the smallest of what I thought was true, it did not bode well for my family, and I needed to end this as quickly as possible. You didn't think it was only one boss, did you? As I looked at what was arrayed against me, his words started to cut through again. My fury sputtered slightly, letting the words in. Even pushing all of my will into mental walls, wasn't enough to keep them out of my head. Since it seems you have gone all out, I shall do the same. Even though I didn't want to focus on him or his words, I couldn't help but look as his body began changing. Even as amateur as I was at sensing auras, the change occurring was easy to spot. His presence grew, and it almost felt like he was growing physically. Like I had to look up to him now, even though we were the same height. His aura spiked from whatever he was doing, and it felt stronger than mine. Not in heaviness sense, but in size. He was E-rank. His arms and legs took on a scaly texture, and his eyes started to change, unable to stick with a permanent color. It was slightly mesmerizing to look at. How do I look? His words changed completely. Where they were just annoying before, and I was able to brush them off with mental walls, and a little willpower, they changed completely now. Like they could penetrate even the most stalwart of defenses. Whatever he just did made my defenses not possible anymore. They became a sultry serenade that I couldn't help but want more of. It was highly distracting at a time when I needed it least. 3 of the bosses from the previous 5 waves surrounded me, and I couldn't afford any mistakes. Instinctively, I used Identify C to confirm my suspicions. Human? Level? He was E-rank. He had to have one of the 3 paths of power, but I wasn't sure which. I also wasn't sure what kind of bloodline he had, but I figured it made all of his mental skills stronger. This wasn't going the way I thought it would. I dug deeper, pulling everything I had within me, and I charged at the blaze lion. It was the easiest of the 3 to deal with, and getting rid of its hindrance on my ice would make things easier. I aimed to eliminate it first. I didn't even make it 2 steps toward the lion before both the vine bear and the ant queen started to harass me. The bear blocked my path to the lion, and the ant queen attempted to pincer me and take chunks out of my body. The first time I had fought the bear, it was a close fight that I almost lost, but that was after hours of fighting and when I was under level 45 without a bloodline. Now, I was over 7 levels higher, 2 skills richer, and a bloodline to push myself further. I was stronger than it. The last time I fought it, I could somewhat tell what it was feeling during the fight. Nothing complex, only surface-level emotions like shock and surprise. Now, though, I couldn't even glean that. It was like they were robots without a will of their own. I had expected to see shock in the bear at being pushed back, but it revealed nothing. My hammer pounded into it, trying to get through, but it fought without any regard for pain. My massive blows rained down on it, and it didn't do so much as flinch. I could feel the force of the impacts up my arm, and I knew they weren't as weak as the bear made them look. They were swings using all of my strength. That wasn't something it should have been able to ignore. The Ant Queen nipped at me the entire time, making an annoyance of herself. It tore off chunks of my armor, and its mandibles savaged my skin underneath. The Blaze Lion was worse. Just its presence started to heat the area, and I had to spend more mana to cool it back down. It didn't help that the entire time sultry words were whispered in my ear about giving up and letting go. Give in. You're never going to win. All of it added together drove my frustration through the roof. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't battle. This was stalling. He was stalling me while simultaneously attacking my family and trying to get in my head. The longer this battle took, the better his chances of winning got. I was in a race against time, and I was losing. Even as I pulled out all the stops, I couldn't do anything. My hammer was rebuffed by either the bear or the ant, and the Blaze Lion hindered my ice. Everything I was doing was accounted for and planned against. The feeling of despair grew, and I felt the possibility of me losing grow ever more. I felt in my mind that this wasn't a natural feeling, but there was nothing I could do about it. I was fighting back with everything I had, but it just wasn't enough. All the battle, all the killing, all the leveling, and I was going to lose when it mattered most. Just stop fighting. There's nothing for you to fight for anymore. Your family is already dead. Oh, he shouldn't have said that. Those were the wrong words to say to me. Something in me snapped, and the mental fog broke, dispelling completely, and gave me the clarity to see things clearly. The vine bear looked worse for wear and was limping from the blows that I had landed, and the Ant Queen had dents in its exoskeleton and a bent mandible. The only boss without injuries was the Blaze Lion, but I never got close enough to land any in the first place. The battle wasn't as one-sided as I had thought it was. It only appeared that way for some reason. Fury took over, but not the skill, raw, primal fury I felt about the whole situation. He just made a mistake, and I wasn't going to let this chance go by. He should have never mentioned my family. Chapter 103, Frozen to the Core. It wasn't just anger that was running through me. It was my frustrations about everything that had happened so far. We were torn from our home, put into this death trap, and had to fight for our lives against monsters, yet we had to deal with a homicidal maniac like him. And he had the gall to smirk at me. I wouldn't have been so mad if it was only monsters we were up against. But no, it was some asshole acting like a spurned lover because no one helped him. Throwing a tantrum like a toddler. Oh, all of it was making me angry. I wove my ice together to fend off one of the bosses and could only growl in frustration as the Blaze Lion threatened to melt it. His fire law battling against my ice law. It was absurd. It wasn't even the actual boss that was fighting me. It was just some mindless thrall that was putting up resistance. I should have been able to crush it, to decimate it so utterly that it should never have been an issue. Yet here I was, fighting and losing against thralls. It made me angry. The vine bear swatted at me, and I had to defend against the Ant Queen at the same time. Both worked together to pressure me away from the man responsible. The one goading me and acting like he was above everyone else. This never would have been a problem if this fucker would just die. I shot an ice arrow out at him, but it melted before it could reach him. I had had enough. The thought of my ice melting to a mere beast was absurd. It was supposed to be timeless, not melt under the pressure of a wimpy flame. It was supposed to hold firm and be my weapon against my foes, not shatter and break to a little heat. This wasn't the nature of ice, not the ice that I wanted associated with me. Ice was the bringer of winter, the harbinger of the changing seasons as it fell from the sky. It was the end of all, that which awaited all that ever lived. Everything would end up in ice, frozen in the vacuum of space. There were thousands of years of Earth's history where ice reigned supreme, yet mine was melting. Not only melting, but melting to mundane fires produced by a mere beast. When I first acquired my law, I focused on the hardness aspect of it so that I could make a good weapon. With hardness came the cold needed to do it. This time I focused on something different. Ice was more than just cold. It was the desolate landscape of the barren tundra. It was the debilitating chill that was impossible to get rid of. The silent killer that people tried and failed to ward off. It was the winter wind that made fires go out and refused to light again. It was more than just hard. It was the basis on which winter was built. There would be no winter without ice. There would be no Arctic or blizzards or glaciers without ice. Ice was where they all started and where cold originated. That was what I wanted. I pushed my law into my surroundings and pushed for it to smother everything. To pervade it with its chill and show it the meaning of cold. I focused entirely on the coldness aspect of it and the authority ice held over the environment. Pulling inspiration from both permafrost and the frost rune I spent hours painstakingly building. I wove my law into the space around me and I ordered it to freeze. I could feel my bloodline aiding my efforts. I based the effects I wanted on frostbite. I wanted the surrounding ice mana to pervade everything I wanted and freeze it from the inside out. The entire time, my hammer swung through the air trying to kill the bosses attacking me, hindering my progress. This wasn't the mountain meditation where I first got my law, but it was where I would force it into being. I pushed my will into my idea the same way I had when making my hammer for the first time. A force worked against me, but my will was stronger. For this, I would not be denied. My family was facing a crisis right now and the man responsible stood before me, yet I could do nothing. I needed more. There were sharp pains in my brain as I worked to subvert natural order, but I pushed through those as well. Some were from reality fighting me, some were from the man standing across from me. Neither would deter my will. All of my concentration worked on the task other than what was needed to continue my melee. All the words that spilled out of the bastard's mouth were ignored. Pushing and prodding, forcing my idea into reality. I felt it click. I felt the very moment the world stopped fighting me and relinquished what I wanted. Also hearing the notification chime to go with it. In the middle of battle, I declined to pull it up, but I knew what it would say and the words that would be projected. Law upgraded. Least law of ice - lesser law of ice. I felt the difference immediately. The fires of the blaze lion dimmed and threatened to go out completely in the new environment I projected. If it were closer, I felt that they would be extinguished entirely. That said nothing of the area around me, which was plunged into a deeper cold. Glacial presence more than doubled its boost from the drop in temperature. Everything came easier than before, and I wielded my new weapon as masterfully as I could. Without the interference from the blaze lion, I could focus on killing either the vine bear or the ant queen. I felt the vine bear was the easier of the two, and started with it. I pulled on my skill and a thick ice fortress separated the two bosses. The ice felt colder and stronger than normal, which I associated with the additional chime. Now separated, I closed in on my prey. The bear's vines started to freeze in my presence, and as it moved, began to break and flake away. Couldn't handle the severe cold I was exuding. My hammer came down with a fully loaded frostbite, and I heard another chime. Frostbite, thrived on pervading a being and freezing it through, exactly what I had based my newly upgraded law on. It was no surprise the skill upgraded when the two were used together. The hammerhead clobbered the bear upside the head, knocking it to the side. Ice built up on the impact site in much higher quantities and quickness than before. I could feel the invading ice mana inside the bear, and I grinned at the beast savagely. Blood covering my teeth from the battering I received previously. What I was about to do was almost an homage to the first time I had faced the beast. At least then, the fight had been honorable. What just occurred was a mockery of that. I paid those thoughts no heed and continued with what I had planned. The bear put up a fight against my skill, but it was worn out and half-ragged at this point. The only reason it was still standing was because it was forced. It wouldn't be standing long. Shatter on. Half of the bear's skull exploded in a shower of gore that quickly froze. I used the skill again on the ice fortress, which showered everything near in ice spikes. It died quickly. Not wasting good ammunition, I began my usual tactic of spinning them around me. The fire in the camp and the blaze lion had made that unfeasible before, but not anymore. Their efforts were comical at best at disrupting what was mine. My ice would not be melted so easily again. With the vine bear's death, I turned on the pesky Ant Queen who had been a thorn in my side the entire fight, taking chunks out of my armor and gouging out pieces of me. I didn't go at this the same way as before. The last time I had fought it, I pummeled it into submission with my hammer without letting up. My ice couldn't penetrate its exoskeleton, rendering most of my skills useless. Not this time. Metal didn't do well in the cold, and it had only grown colder as the fight went on. The first time, I hadn't been able to freeze the thing through to kill it. It had enough power and a law of its own to fight me over it. It was a losing battle that I had abandoned the first time. It was harder to affect another's body offensively than it was to defend your own. In a battle where laws were at the same tier, it would be extremely difficult to influence the other person's body. While saying it was an uphill battle didn't make it an ironclad rule. Using laws that were strong against one another made the fight significantly easier, like with lightning and water. A lightning law would have an easier time electrocuting a water law wielder than it would for an ice law to freeze a fire law wielder. It was just the way nature worked. Metal and ice didn't have that relationship. Metal didn't have an inherent weakness to the cold, but it was disadvantaged at severe cold temperatures. Like now. It wasn't a weakness to the cold per se, but it certainly affected it. It grew brittle and broke easily in sub-zero temperatures, but the metal itself didn't grow weaker. It actually grew stronger. Strength wasn't the issue I was having, though. The massive dents in the Ant Queen could attest to that. I could overwhelm the ant's metal body, but I couldn't do any lasting damage because it only deformed instead of fracturing. The cold would fix that. The oversized insect tried to do battle against me, but it was slow and sluggish from the environment which I wasted little time exploiting. The newly upgraded Frostbite slammed down on it a few times, pervading it with ice mana. Shatter wouldn't work this time as there were no fluids to freeze and explode like the vine bear. I used Frostbite for a different purpose, a purpose that became apparent when my next hammer blow hit. Layering on Mighty Blow as well as the upgraded Frostbite the area where the hammer landed shattered into metal shards. This hardness overwhelmed, causing it to fail. Metal broke and crumpled away in greater volume the longer I wailed on it. More and more blows rained down on it to increasing effect. The cold, brittle metal was unable to hold up. It didn't last long. With both bosses killed, my next target was what stood between me and my enemy. The blazed lion positioned itself between us, forcing me to go through one more enemy. What h how did you dash? The man's words lost their sultry effect as he stared dumbly at the two slain bosses. I could see the gears turning in his head as he looked over my form, observing what was no doubt a host of wounds with blood freezing them shut, a knife lodged in my back, and deep gouges that had ice patched over them keeping them from leaking. I could feel the incredulousness in his gaze, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was so shocking to him that his words lost their effect. Standing over the two dead bosses, I could feel something stir in me, like the core of my being was waking up, asking to be heard. I didn't have time to figure out the feeling right now and focused my attention back on the fight. Ignoring the stunned man, I launched myself at the blazed lion. It was the weakest physically of the trio sent against me and the lowest level from how it felt. It was mostly there to hinder my ice, which was impossible now. As I swung down to pulverize the beast, I thought of something different. It was a stupid and wasteful idea, but I did it anyway. If nothing else then to keep the man stuttering in shock. I released my grip on my hammer and reached out with both hands to grasp the beast. Tried to escape, but I didn't let it. My stats were higher than its, and all of my boosts pushed them beyond what the lion could achieve. After firmly holding it in place, I flooded it with ice mana with the use of Frostbite through my grip. The skill wasn't meant to be used like that, but I pushed it anyway. The fire burning inside the beast tried to fight back, to burn with higher intensity, but it couldn't. My ice invaded its body and snuffed it out with vigor. The fire in its eyes dimmed and the struggle it put up diminished. The kicking legs and snapping jaws slowed until it stopped utterly. Its fight smothered completely before a stronger will. Frost built up on its fur and the fiery mane itself froze. I pushed more and more against it before it finally lay still. unmoving in an unlikely death for a member of its kind. Frozen to the core. Chapter 104 Death. Chris. Point of view. With all 3 bosses dead, all that was left standing was me and the man responsible for this whole thing. He had recovered from the shock of me defeating the bosses and was trying to direct the monsters surrounding us into the fray. All the good that did. They were little more than an annoyance now, and they fell to the ice swirling around me easily, cutting and pulverizing anything that entered their range. They entered into a 50-foot area around me and were swiftly chopped to pieces. Even so, the man continually directed them to die. Words streamed out of his mouth trying to worm their way into my head, but I didn't let them. I clamped down on any foreign influence trying to influence me and obliterated it completely. The feeling that something deep inside was welling up came back as I walked over the blazed lion's frozen corpse, but I didn't know what it was. Without any more beasts to interfere, I leveled my gaze upon the one who had caused all of this. The man who couldn't leave well enough alone and thought himself invincible. It was vindicating to see him brought so low, sputtering and flailing around like some coward. Every step took me closer to him and the end of the whole charade. Seeing his beasts get slaughtered trying to defend him, he pulled out a sword to defend himself. Seeing the weapon, I couldn't help but snort. Now he was gonna fight like a real warrior? To defend himself with his meager abilities. With the weapon in hand, he gained control over himself and stood ready for battle. It was laughable. He thought he could fight me, the same man who just decimated his army, and he thought he could put up any resistance against me. The thought spurned me. His sword wouldn't save him. The mindbreaker. Point of view. None of his skills were working. Every suggestion he made either flowed off the man or was torn through like paper. All the mental manipulations had no effect, and he couldn't even anchor one mental claw into his mind. Ever since he mentioned his family dying, all influence was rejected utterly. Like some switch was flipped, and the claws he had made trying to worm his way in were severed. He had miscalculated. Craig pulled as much as he could on the bloodline he had assimilated to no avail. The Jade Scale Siren was one of the most expensive purchases he had made, and it was failing him. What was supposed to elevate his mental skills past the point of being shrugged off failed. It was like trying to dig into frozen earth during winter, when the earth was so hard that metal shovels broke and splintered before digging in. Craig had no idea how the man was doing it. Nothing else in the tutorial had been able to stand up to him after gaining his siren bloodline. Everything fell under its influence with a few skills, even more so after evolving to E rank. His new class and class skills were supposed to be unmatched inside their tutorial, especially by someone not even in the same rank. He had identified the Icy Warrior already, and he was only level 50, not even evolved to E rank yet. That was the beginning of his miscalculations. Craig thought that trapping the powerful man inside his camp would give him a new mighty warrior to add to his army. He had seen the man's strength and knew that it would be a great boon to add it to his army. His rank advantage had given him confidence. A confidence that was now thoroughly shattered. That was the reason he left his keep. The keep he yearned to be in right now to separate him away from this monster. He had made a grave mistake, and everything he did to try to escape was shot down. All of his more powerful beasts were out with the rest of his army. He had only kept the 3 best suited to deal with the suicidal warrior. Craig hadn't thought the man would throw himself, alone, into his camp, and he had thought to capitalize on that separation. There was never going to be another chance to dominate him so easily, when he was alone and surrounded by his minions, where every second wasted was another step toward defeat. That was why he mentioned his family's death. Craig had thought that saying that the man would give up and fall to his influence, to falter at the mention of what had caused Craig such pain and despair himself. He regretted that now. He should have never mentioned his family. It was like the man was reborn after that, like caution was thrown to the wind and he emptied all of who he was into the fight. Craig's mental shackles were slogged off, and the 3 powerful bosses he had kept specifically for him were torn asunder. Easily at that. He remembered watching as the blazed lion, a once fiery inferno, froze solid. Who did something like that? Who had the strength to do something like that? Craig thought he alone held that kind of strength. Where Craig had an army of minions at his beck and call, this man alone was an army in and of itself. All of Craig's plans were dashed now, little more than a child's fantasies. He had thought his army would sweep through the tutorial, killing all who had done nothing to save his family, killing all who had denied him aid. It was all futile now. His grand plans were left unrealized. Regret and disbelief raged in his mind, but there was nothing he could do to stop the man's advance toward him. With every step the man got closer, it was like the gallows came with him. It felt as if he came any closer, Craig's doom was assured. An inescapable dread fell over him. The chill of death, that only made him rage more. He refused to accept it. Why couldn't he have this kind of strength? Why did this man get what he was denied? If Craig could have been given this strength, his family would still be alive. His girls would still have a future left to live. Craig pulled his sword out of its sheath and stood to face the man down. He used to have the warrior class and he still had some skills from it. Skills like power strike and sword mastery. He hadn't used them in a while, but he could knock the cobwebs off now. There was no use in trying his mental skills any longer as they would be ripped apart. Some confidence flowed back into him with those thoughts. The ice-clad juggernaut didn't even have identify block, which left his level easy to see. Craig was over level 60, over 10 levels of difference. Plus, his class was a rare variant. His profession was up there too. Lower than his class but still in E rank. Yes, he could maybe get lucky. Stall long enough for his more powerful beasts to get back and save him. The warrior had to be running on fumes. He had used a monumental amount of mana already and the willpower to shrug off Craig's influence wasn't small. He wouldn't be able to do it forever. Yes, there was still a way out of this. The man's advance suddenly stopped and he spoke for the first time. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Both hands rested on the hammer that had brought so much destruction. The massive weapon planted on the ground. Did he have anything to say for himself? The words angered him. Who was he to act so arrogant? Like Craig was somebody to be looked down upon? Well, since he was delaying to open up a dialogue, Craig would use this. He pulled on his bloodline to infuse his words with all his will and activated all the skills he could. Mercy! I surrender. I'll call off him dash. His words died in his throat as the hammer shot up and around before slamming into his side, launching him through the air. His breath left him, making him sputter and hyperventilate to get it back. Blood and spittle ran down his mouth from the unexpected impact. The scales on his body blunted some of the impact, but that didn't stop the damage. Ribs broke and fractured along with his insides getting turned to mush from the force. Pain exploded out of his side and his mind struggled to focus. The coughing wouldn't stop and yet more blood joined the pile he had already spit up. While hacking up globs of blood, Craig couldn't help but think, how is he so strong? The hammer felt like getting hit by a runaway train. Did you think I would believe that? That pleading for mercy would work? There is only one thing that people like you deserve. The man's walk toward his crippled form was even and firm. Every footfall without hesitation. The man stood over Craig and there was nothing he could do about it. His sword was flung from his hand after the attack. An attack so fast he could barely see it, let alone defend against it. The fact it was so fast and carried such strength should have been impossible. The man stopped and looked Craig in the eyes. He locked on to them without flinching at what should have been the mesmerizing effect they gained when calling on his bloodline. Only one word came after his statement. Death. Blackness followed and all the useless emotions that welled up inside him splattered into oblivion matching his brain matter. His last thought was one of regret. He didn't even see the hammer. Chris. Point of view. I couldn't help but feel a small amount of vindication as I stood over his exploded head. While gory and graphic it may be, satisfaction was hard to not feel. I had done it, killed the man responsible. Now all I had to do was clean up the rest of them. Instantly, beasts started to go wild, rampaging around. They scrambled to kill each other and started a massive brawl. The people were different. They stood stock still, almost like statues. It was odd to see the dichotomy of the two. The humans had lost what drove them and there was no getting it back. The monsters subverted to their base instincts, the ones the tutorial instilled in them. It was no doubt happening everywhere else as well. The humans that were under his compulsion stood listlessly, doing nothing but standing still. It was eerie to see them so lifeless. There had to be a way to return them to who they were, but that wasn't something we had the power to do. Instead of staying in the camp to kill the monsters, I left and ran back toward where my family was fighting. The monsters in the camp would kill each other. There was no need for me to stay. Plus, I had a bad feeling welling up inside me. The fight to kill the Mindbreaker took longer than I thought it would. A lot of things could have happened during my family's fight while I was dealing with the 3 bosses. They were difficult to get through and delayed my return. Austin was strong, the only E-rank, but there were a lot of beasts sent against them. They had fortifications and fallback lines, but if the fight was anything like what I just went through, something bad was bound to happen. The worry was so great that my wounds were forgotten as I rushed back. The knife in my back ignored, and the gashes marring my form were powered through. It was hard to see the battle lines from where I was because it wasn't the only battle taking place anymore. Everywhere was a battle. Beasts fought each other and the stationary thralls as much as anything else. It wasn't the obvious front line it had been. As I neared where they should be, I couldn't help but feel something was wrong. That something had happened while I was away. Skills and spells still flew through the air from the last line of fortifications we had set up, and that was a bad sign already. If they were pushed all the way back there, something went poorly. I slaughtered my way toward them, decimating any beast in my range while rushing as fast as my legs would take me. Some skills flew in my direction, but they weren't hard to deflect. Exiting the sea of bodies, I saw the rubble the fortifications had been turned into. The wall we originally built was destroyed, and in its place were hastily made barricades by either Jonathan or the Earth Mage. Fires raged and bodies were everywhere. The ground was slick with blood and viscera. It was hell incarnate. Humans and beasts alike dotted the landscape, and I had to pull myself away from looking for someone I knew among the faces. Reaching the wall was easy, and after they realized who it was, they stopped showering me in attacks. The fighters holding off the beasts didn't look pressured, so I left them to it to venture further into the defenses. After being released from their compulsion, the threat the beasts represented dropped significantly. They didn't operate as one whole army anymore, which made it easy to pick them off as they charged. The warriors could handle it for the moment. I would return after finding out the state of things to finish up. I couldn't help but note the grim faces they wore and the wounds that covered them. They were fighting the beasts like they had wronged them somehow, with a viciousness that I hadn't seen since. Oh no. No. The last time they had taken a fight that personally was after Grandad. Bursting through the camp, I came upon something that I had been dreading. The uneasy feelings and the dread I felt on the way here were realized. In what could only be described as a makeshift field hospital, bodies lay in various states of health. Some had only scrapes and gashes that healers were tending to. Others were worse. Others were still lifeless and ignored. Without a healer using skills to mend them, people were dead. Chapter 105 Farewell. It wasn't the lifeless bodies lying still in the field that caught my attention. It wasn't the ones in the makeshift field hospital either. There was one lying a few feet behind the front line that caught my eye for some reason. The axe and shield stood out. They were covered in blood, but I would know those pieces anywhere. I was the one who made them. I wanted to be wrong, to say that my eyes weren't seeing what they were currently seeing. I scrambled toward the body and couldn't stop my hammer from falling to the ground as I saw it. The thud didn't even register to my ears, and all outside noise was ignored. The sounds of battle and shouting fell away as I looked down at him. The man who raised me, the man who had been there for me through my 24 years of life, bleeding out from the fatal wound on his stomach. I didn't know what to think. It looked recent, like he had only fallen moments ago, like he had held on until the moment he knew I was back. Knew that his job was done and he could sag to the ground. He wasn't going to make it. It didn't take a doctor to figure that out. Blood pooled at a brutal pace, and it was only getting worse the more time went on. He wasn't going to make it. I knew that deep down, but couldn't bring myself to actually think it. What kind of world did we get pulled into where such a happy and joyful man who has raised 3 kids and even had young grandchildren had his life cut short like this? I just stared at him, dumbstruck, while his lifeblood tricked onto the ground. Thousands of thoughts ran through my head and hundreds of things that I wanted to say to him formulated on my tongue, but nothing made it out of my mouth. He was coughing up blood and reaching to get up, but it was without the strength necessary to do so. Even though he was still alive, I knew what was to come. The wound was too big, the blood leaking out was too much. He was going to die. It was a miracle he hadn't already. My mind was so scrambled, frost armor dissipated, dropping away to reveal my form underneath, wounds and all. The blood leaking out of me joined the pool already at my feet. It was all just too much. Everything was just too much. Every fiber of my being wished that this was some kind of joke or illusion, that everything would go back to the way it was before this nightmare started. How did someone watch their father die right in front of their eyes without the power to do anything about it? How do you? Son, come here. Dad managed to croak out before coughing up even more blood. There was just so much blood. My feet responded before my mind caught up with what he said. I shuffled over to him and knelt next to him. Some of his blood started soaking into my pants. Some of it was on my hands, but that was my last concern. Get your sister, Dad mumbled softly. She should be here for this. I immediately shouted for Abigail like it was my only goal in life. I must have sounded like a manic madman by the way I was frantically shouting. Some of the warriors that were still fighting on the front lines looked at me funny. They hadn't realized the body beside them. They didn't know the severity of the wounds. They were blissfully unaware of the person that was about to die. They probably thought he was going to be fine, healed up with a few skills from a healer. They were wrong. There was no healing to fix the gaping hole in his torso. Dad cringed at the loud yelling, but I ignored it. Thankfully, Abigail was close by in the makeshift field hospital and heard my shouting quickly. She sprinted over to me when she heard my voice, her hair flapping in the wind. It must have fallen out of her bun during the battle. Blood coated her clothes in thick splotches, and even more was on her hands from healing someone's injury from earlier. Everyone that heard my yelling could tell that this was serious, and she had a concerned look on her face as she neared. As she got closer and noticed who it was that I was kneeling over, her face morphed from concern to curious as to why I was yelling so frantically. Then she saw the massive wound on his chest and stomach, the gaping maw of what used to be a ribcage and the ungodly amount of blood around him. Her face went white. No, 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 no. This can't be happening. She mumbled to herself as her hands started to glow green from the effects of a healing skill as she knelt and put her hands on the wound. The healing wouldn't help. It was too late for that. Even if she was there immediately after, I didn't think it would have made a difference. Most of his entire chest was missing or mangled. I was once again amazed at his ability to fight through something like this, to only falter when he knew I was back. Maybe miracles did exist. I got to be here for what would be his last moments after all. It was almost cruel. Our father was dying and there was nothing that we could do but watch. All of us watched as the healing did nothing. We all knew it wouldn't work. I knew she knew and Dad knew. Help me up? Dad said, coughing up more blood, reaching for my hand. No, you need to stay down. If one healer isn't enough, then we'll get another, and if that doesn't work, we'll get another. We can use all the healing potions from the store. I'm not letting you die. Abigail practically screamed out while tears started streaming down her face, all the while never dropping the healing spell. Abigail, he said gruffly to her. Save your healing for the others, don't waste it on me. We both know my end is near. No, I can fix this. I can heal you. She started shaking her head quickly, making her hair even more messy as even more tears were falling from her face. The glow intensified on her hands and more of her skills flared, but still, there was no effect on his body. Dad must have seen the futility of getting her to stop and looked at me. Help me up, son. There was nothing I could do. He was going to die either way, just one was while lying down in a pool of his own blood, and the other was doing whatever it was he wanted to do. Seeing it made no difference in the outcome, I acquiesced to his request. I grabbed him under the arms and lifted him to his feet as he let out a loud grunt of pain. He stumbled a little as I let go of his arms, most likely woozy from the blood loss. There was even more of it under him than I thought. There was so much blood. Abigail must have finally realized the inevitable conclusion and canceled the spell on her hands. Her opposition to my decision was clear. She looked at me with a spiteful glare as I lifted him. "Both of you have made me proud to be your father." He looked from me to her as a tear escaped his eye. "You have turned into amazing people." He looked at Abigail and added, "And a great mother of her own." We both had things that we wanted to say, but he waved us off and continued. "Tell your mother and brother that I love them, and that I'm sorry I couldn't make it back. Especially your mother." He coughed up some more blood that dribbled down his chin, but added under his breath, "She's gonna be furious with me. I know what both of you are going to say, and it's not necessary. I know you both love me, but I don't have a lot of time. I have been thinking about this a lot, and I want to go down fighting on the off chance there is a Valhalla." He let out a chuckle at his own words. Over the years of religious debate with him, I championed the idea that if one of them was real, why not all of them? If heaven and hell existed, why not Valhalla? I had said it as a joke at the time. To hear him say that now was almost laughable. After saying that, some color started coming back to his face and he straightened his back a smidge, standing up straighter. He must have used some kind of boosting skill or something. There was no other way to recover like that. Even though I knew what he was about to do, I didn't have the will to stop him. It was the way I would have wanted to go out. Who was I to tell him no? He lifted his hand and separated his fingers into a V. "Tell your brother that I said, 'Live long and prosper.'" I almost let out a chuckle before I stopped myself. That was just so like him. Dad was bleeding out, minutes away from death, and he's talking about Star Trek to my brother. Dad had always been a huge Star Trek fan and watched all of the movies and TV shows. I never got into it like he did, but my brother did. They used to watch all the old reruns of the show together when he was younger. I was always more of a Star Wars fan. He turned to Abigail next. "Abigail, you know you're the oldest. You have to keep the rest of them in line. Be the backbone of the family. Don't let them miss any family dinners now that I won't be there to force them." Abigail laughed at that and wiped the tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. "Of course, Dad. I won't let them weasel out of it," she said back, but it wasn't with the same vigor as before. It was missing her usual fire. Dad started to speak again before stopping and choking back a sob. "You'll always be my little girl." He pushed out as more tears fell and he hugged her. Abigail just nodded and started crying harder into his chest. They broke the hug and he sighed. Then he looked at me. "Son, I guess I'll finally find out what they're dying to get in there for." This time I couldn't hold back my laughter at the long-standing joke. Ever since I was a kid, we shared that joke with each other. It started when he was driving me to soccer practice or a soccer game. I couldn't quite remember, but we passed a cemetery. He nudged me while driving and pointed, saying, "Christopher, guess what?" I was like 12 at the time and looked at the cemetery he was pointing at. "I don't know." "What?" He looked at me with a straight face and said, "They're just dying to get in there." I didn't know why, but I thought it was the funniest thing that I had ever heard and laughed for almost 10 minutes straight. Ever since then, every time we pass the cemetery, without fail, we say the joke. It was to the point where I would just be driving alone and chuckle to myself as I passed one. "You'll have to tell me one day," I said back after my laughter died down. The words nearly died in my throat, but I managed to push through. Even Abigail let out a laugh or two, even though she always hated that joke. She and my mother thought it was crass and crude. "Tell your mother that I love her and that I'll be waiting for her," I heard him say to Abigail as I reached down and picked up the axe that he dropped. I knew he would be needing it soon. He took the axe from me, the axe I had made for him, the axe that I had hoped would protect him, and looked me in the eye. We just stared like that before he nodded, and I nodded back. His eyes held more in that moment than ever before. He did the same to Abigail. He looked at us both one last time and started walking towards the wave of beasts that the other group was still fighting. The last thing he said before he walked away was, "Live with honor." All I could do was watch his back as he got farther and farther away and whisper to myself, "Die with glory." He picked up speed as he got closer to the front line, and as he passed it, he was almost at a full sprint. He must have had some mana left, as I saw him fell the first few beasts with some weapon skills as he waded into the mass of bodies. He didn't have much left in the tank, I could tell, because he was moving slower and slower. Most was spent in getting him up and walking, not leaving much left after. His shield blocked less and his axe moved slower. Skills got fired off more infrequently. His fortitude and vitality must have been on their last legs. As I watched my father's last moments, my anger started rising. I just kept getting angrier and Barbarian's Fury, almost reactivated on its own after I had cancelled it. Why did this have to happen? Why did I have to stand here and watch my father die? What was the reason behind all of this? What was the point? My anger reached its peak and I stood there shaking as Dad was too slow to dodge out of the way of a swipe. He couldn't recover fast enough before another attack came from behind him and knocked him down. I didn't get to see the rest as the bodies got in the way. But the ending was clear. It was over. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought that I could see wisps of smoke coming off of me like in some cartoon, and a character got so angry they started smoking. But I was in no mind to think about that right now. Giant scythes of ice froze around me and launched over the area where he had fallen. The ice reaped the lives of beasts as easily as it would wheat. While I let him die in battle, I wasn't going to allow his body to be eaten. The familiar chime of a system notification sounded out, but I ignored it as that was the last thing that I wanted to look at right now. I just turned to my sister and hugged her while crying like a baby. I didn't care that I was a man of 24 years. When someone's father died, it didn't matter how old you were. Chapter 106. It was me. Abigail, I'm gonna need you to heal me up, I said. Anger coursed through me like a hot knife through butter. I wanted to fight something, smash something to bits. The only thing that stopped me was the various wounds I had. The knife still in my back mostly. Abigail, for her part, listlessly worked over my body with her healing before getting to the knife. She pulled it out and layered multiple of her more potent healing skills onto the area. The whole time she said nothing. Total silence. It was like her mind shut down and wouldn't come up with words to say. Only working on autopilot as she healed me up. It didn't take long and I was good enough to get back into the fight. Healing to 100% would take a while yet, but it was enough to go hit something. And go hit something I did. It was a sobering trip home. The now uncontrolled beasts met their end swiftly and brutally, probably wishing they were somewhere else away from the walking calamity I turned into. The hours following my father's death were a blur. There were so many emotions that I had to work through that it was hard to remember much of what happened. I can say that it was bloody though, that I knew with certainty. Even taking it out on the surrounding beasts didn't do much for the pit of jumbled thoughts I was going through. I was easily aggravated, snappy, and an overall chore to be around. Austin tried to be there for me, but that wasn't what I wanted right now. Wasn't what I needed. Jonathan saw to my sister, comforting her, which took a load off of me. I wasn't sure I would be able to deal with my grief while comforting her at the same time. Abigail even felt bad for me because I didn't have someone like that. Her pity only made me more angry. I took care of the surrounding beasts while everyone else cleaned up the best they could. Spent consumables couldn't be recovered, but the equipment could. From both our camp and the minebreakers. Anyone healthy scavenged the battlefield for anything valuable they could find, piling it all up near our makeshift camp. Kathy sent a message back to have people come up to help with the cleanup, who arrived a few hours later. There was a lot we needed to do and not enough people to do it. The 27th wave was coming tomorrow and we had to be packed and returned before then. Wounded needed to be carried back along with equipment and supplies. Most had been used, but there were a few that hadn't, along with things we could take as loot. One thing we did take the time for was a funeral. The few hours it took to get there were non-negotiable for us. It was something we had to do. We moved the bodies back to the hill adjacent to our camp and dug holes. Yes, bodies and holes plural. My father wasn't the only one who met their end today. 4 of us were gone. Our number dwindled to 17. Barely above half what we started with. Other than my father, Scott and Diana both met their end. One in a rushed retreat where she fell and couldn't recover fast enough, and the other in a false sense to save his wife. The tutorial hadn't been kind to Uncle Scott's family, and it mercilessly took all of them. his son, his wife, and him. The last of the dead was my cousin Christian. When I asked how he died, Austin didn't answer. He was unusually cagey about the subject, and that caginess was going to end now. I had let it go before because there were still things to do and I was needed elsewhere. Now, on the walk back to camp, I wanted answers. I wanted to find out what happened after I left. For people dead was a lot, but that said nothing about the wounded. People were gravely injured, with some even missing limbs. The healers still weren't sure if they would be able to reattach them or grow them back. There was still too much they didn't know to start the procedure in the dark. While walking back to our camp for the funeral, I singled Austin out to get some answers. How? How did this happen? I asked with a bit more force than intended. We had planned meticulously, and I was having trouble coming up with reasons for how it turned out so poorly. It shouldn't have turned out this bad. We had plans to retreat if it did. Not fight to the death. A live to fight another day sort of thing. It all went to shit after you left. We were fighting the new arrivals off with the traps and consumables, but it all went wrong all of a sudden. Your dad, Jonathan, and I were holding off the hordes as best we could with help from people behind us. One minute, I was stabbing through monsters as quickly as I could. The next, half the fortifications blew up behind me. I wasn't sure how any got through or how it happened. I was too far away at the time to know for sure, but I heard yelling as we were falling back to the second line of fortifications, and that only made me more confused at the time. Kathy and Abigail were yelling at each other heatedly, basically screaming at each other, but I couldn't take the time to find out why. I was busy fighting. I only found out later what happened and the reason they were screaming at each other. Kathy accused Christian of sabotaging the fortifications, and Abigail was defending him, saying that it wasn't something he would do. Austin sighed. That was unexpected. Anger flared in me at her accusation. I expected to see the same in Austin, but his face painted a different picture. His lack of emotion confused me further. Christian wouldn't do something like that, though. I defended. Why would he sabotage the fortifications? That's what I and the rest of the family thought. We thought that Kathy was wrong, and we ignored her accusation to focus on the fighting. Our retreat didn't go perfectly since it was unexpected, but it went better than it could have. That was, until it happened again. Austin's resigned tone told me more than words could have. No, he couldn't have. Why would he? There were witnesses the second time. I saw him do it myself. He confessed. But why? Why would he do that? I yelled. My mind couldn't come up with a reason he would do that. I had known Christian for a long time, and nothing I knew about him pointed toward him doing something like this. Austin just gave me a flat look until I came to the conclusion on my own. We were fighting someone who could manipulate people, and that wasn't the first thing I had considered. That showed my naivety. I believed that my family was above that, like there was no way that we would be influenced like that. Like a child who believed their parents could do no wrong. When? He was never gone from camp for long. When could it have happened? Questions streamed out of my mouth as I tried to wrap my head around what I was hearing. It seemed unreal. We don't know. There's speculation, obviously, but without him here to tell us, that's all it will be. It could have been whenever for all we know. I was surprised there wasn't more anger in his tone. Anger at the fact a member of our family was manipulated like that. After the second line fell so soon after the first, panic spread and people scrambled to retreat again. In the chaos, Diana was lost before we made it to the third line. Scott watched it happen and threw himself into the tide of monsters to save her. He didn't last long. Hearing that Christian caused 2 deaths because of what he did was a blow. Logically, it wasn't his actions that caused them to die, but realistically, it was hard to separate him from what he did. Wait, if he was under the Mindbreaker's influence, how did he die? Looking deeper at the man next to me, the lack of normal emotions he would show about something like this, the sadness that teetered on guilt, and all the other signs that I had attributed to grief. It almost hurt to ask the question. How did he die? A hurt and guilty expression flashed on Austin's face before he controlled it back to neutral. All he did was look up with eyes that said I didn't want to know the answer. Eyes that somehow pleaded with me to not make him answer. This was too important. I needed to know how he died, and I pressed for an answer. How? Austin sighed deeply before answering. It was me. The words shouldn't have been a shock, but somehow they still were. Everything I was picking up on pointed to that exact conclusion, but I so wanted it to be wrong. It wasn't. Silence accompanied both of us while we walked for a few minutes after that. Neither one of us knew what to say next. My mind was a mess with thoughts and I didn't know what to do about it. There were too many things happening at once and it was overwhelming. My father had just died and now I was being told family had to kill family. It was too much to take in. My immediate reaction was anger. Anger toward Austin for doing something like that, but it didn't last long before another smothered its fire. Jumping to conclusions wouldn't help anyone and I had to think the whole thing through. Christian was a liability that could have caused more deaths if left to continue sabotaging them. Could have ended with my whole family dead instead of just Scott and Diana. Neutralizing that threat was the right course of action. But how did someone do that? How did one kill family? The silence worked to feed my jumbled thoughts, and they continued singing their song in my head of cousinside? Was there even a word for that? Austin was silent the entire time, letting me process the bombshell he had just ignited. His shoulders were slumped slightly and he looked conflicted in his own right. I couldn't fathom the guilt he must be feeling right now. Seeing him like that worked to bring me out of my introspection and focus on what was in front of me. My friend was hurting and I needed to be there for him. It didn't matter what he did, it was necessary. I wanted to ask more questions, but now wasn't the time. How was Sam taking this? Her son wasn't killed in battle, but by our own side? Pushing those thoughts away was hard, but I managed to do it. What was needed of me right now wasn't to be questioning his decision, but to pat him on the back and tell him it was all right. The last thought I had on the subject was one I wouldn't get out of my head anytime soon. Would I have been able to do the same? I didn't know if I wanted the answer to that. For some things, ignorance was bliss. It didn't take long to reach our camp after that. The remaining family dug holes for the ones who wouldn't be with us anymore. It was one of the first times I cursed my high strength. Digging that hole shouldn't have been that easy. It almost felt wrong for it to be that easy. Everyone said their piece about the ones not with us and we went on with our lives. Once more forced to walk ahead without letting ourselves properly grieve. Before Abigail left, I got the full story out of her, which confirmed all of what Austin said. The argument, the accusations, and the resulting conclusion. It wasn't easier hearing it the second time around. After everything was over, I helped them travel down south for the second time. The wave tomorrow wasn't forgotten and they needed to prepare for it. I needed to do the same, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Part of me didn't want to. The fight was thoroughly extinguished in me today. I didn't get excited at the thought of the battle that was to come. Neither did we celebrate our victory. For all intents and purposes, we should have traveled back to camp victorious. We won, our enemy defeated and dead with their loot ours to claim. From an outside perspective, our return was one closer to defeat rather than triumph. It almost felt wrong to sit in the remnants of camp without everyone. It felt worse to check off a line on my to-do list. Of the 3 things I needed to do before evolving, upgrading my law was completed. It was an unexpected boon during the battle, but it was yet another accomplishment washed of its meaning by tragedy. Now, the only thing left that I could focus on was my spirit anchor. I felt something like what Jonathan described, but I wasn't sure if what I felt was the same. He said that power welled up from deep inside him, and that was exactly what it felt like. But that was also the same spot my bloodline was. Jonathan didn't have a bloodline when he formed his spirit anchor, so he didn't know the difference between the two. Yet more turbid thoughts colored my mind for what felt like the 100th time that day. When the sun finally set, I was glad that the day was finally over. Notifications pinged at me, wanted to be opened, but that wasn't something I wanted to look at right now. I wanted just a moment of peace and to not look at the proof of what had happened today. With only the stars for company, I did not sleep peacefully. Chapter 107 Notifications. Life marched on, ever forward. Spending most of the night in fitful bouts of sleep and grogginess was not how I wanted to spend the night, but it was another thing I had to deal with. The next morning, I finally opened up my notifications to get a look at them. There were the normal kill notifications for the countless thralls that I killed along with the 3 bosses. Those were somehow labeled differently and were considered generals of some kind. I wasn't sure how the thrall structure worked or their chain of command, but they were higher than the normal minions somehow. Now that I had a bloodline, the points weren't as important to me as much. They still were appreciated, just not valued as much as before. Not when it had cost so much to acquire them. There was really only one purchase left that I had to make that was planned. There would surely be some others that popped up unexpectedly or things I could buy if I thought of it, but the only big one left was the genetic material for my evolution. Austin went with the wings and feathers of the golden sun eagle for his evolution, and I was still considering what I would do for mine. There weren't even frost giant parts in the store to buy, not even frostborn parts either. The only thing that was purchasable was frost-touched parts, and those were lower-tiered than my bloodline already. It would still work, we were certain of that from the information we bought, but it wouldn't be as good. It wouldn't add as much as using the right tiered material. The flip side was also true. Higher tiered material also worked and went above and beyond what would normally be possible. It was easier to fail though, which was a huge downside. Just like with organ transplants, the body could reject the change, but that only rarely happened. After assimilating the related bloodline, the body wouldn't reject genetic material of the same likeness. The few times it happened were if the material used was too powerful, like jumping ahead a few tiers of the bloodline. Like trying to use dragon parts when you only had a wormling bloodline. I equated it to an Icarus situation, reaching for too much and burning in the sun. The lack of frost giant parts was a blow, but I had plans to fix that. Every pylon upgrade came with more things that could be purchased. If I ran down south to help Tracy with hers, it would surely go smoothly. I could fight a wave alone at this point with the help of all of them and a majorly defended camp. The sky was the limit. From the notifications, the biggest windfall of points was from the Mindbreaker himself. He was hoarding points, and the notification for killing him proved it. You have slain, human, level 65, 489,664 points earned. We knew that the points received weren't a 100% transfer, some were lost, and we were only given a portion of the points that were held by the person at the time of death. His level alone rewarded over 4,000 points. Seeing the over 400k points from the kill made me wonder how much he actually had. He had to have earned a stupid amount of points from his thralls. Those wonders would remain a mystery. The man was dead, and there was no coming back from the exploded brain he now had. His body was left as food for the vultures. If I weren't capped in experience, he would have given a huge amount of levels. Other humans gave the most amount of experience per level, and he was 15 levels above me. It almost made me lament my decision to wait on my evolution until logic beat out greed. Logically, waiting to evolve was the best possible choice. It would give me the best options for a new class that would boost my power further. Rushing ahead just because I could was short-sighted and would actively weaken me in the long run. I could always level later. I only got one shot at an evolution. All the points I earned through the battle added up to get me over the 1 million mark once again, and the wave tomorrow would only add to that. The last wave netted me 700,000, and this one would only be higher. After the long list of kill notifications were the skill upgrades that I had acquired. The law was with this one as well, and I pulled it up to look it over. Law upgraded. Least law of ice - lesser law of ice. It said exactly what I thought it would. My least law was now one step higher. Lesser didn't sound like a lot, but the power difference proved that it was. I wouldn't have been able to beat the Mindbreaker without the upgraded law. Next were the skill upgrades. You have upgraded a skill. Ice Fortress. Uncommon. - Icy Bastion. Rare. Frostbite. Uncommon. - Pervading Cold. Rare. Mental Walls. Common. - Mental Freeze. Uncommon. Those three came during the battle with the Mindbreaker after I upgraded my law. The new law was perfect for Frostbite and combined together to upgrade the skill into Pervading Cold are Pervading Cold. Rare. Saturate your blows with piercing ice mana, corrupting and pervading anything hit with a debilitating cold. Adds to the penetrating power of your strikes while leaving a cold damage over time effect. The skill was what I expected from the way it felt to use. After the upgrade, it was much more powerful and the cold effect it applied was a lot stronger. It took more mana to use, but that was an acceptable trade-off for the increased power of the skill. Ice Fortress, was another that upgraded during the fight. My law pushed it into the next rarity, making the walls colder and stronger than before. Icy Bastion, rare, creates a bastion of ice at the designated area. Mana cost affects the size and shape that the bastion takes along with thickness. Maximum area and thickness are determined by mastery of the skill along with skill rarity. The text of the skill was similar to the two skills before it. Ice Wall, C, and Ice Fortress, UN. Both had similar text associated with their skills. It was still a good upgrade to have and increased my defensive capabilities tremendously. The last skill to upgrade during the fight was Mental Walls, C. It shouldn't have been a surprise that the skill upgraded, and it was a nice addition to the other two. I knew exactly when the other two had upgraded during the fight because the skills felt different to use and had increased effects. They flowed easier and did more for the same cost in mana. It was obvious when I was using them. Mental Walls, C. Not so much. It was already hard to tell when the skill was activated because it had no outward effect. It shielded my mind from outside influence, which was hard to notice if I wasn't looking for it. Upgrading from common to uncommon was easier than uncommon to rare, but it was still a nice addition. If I ever ran into anyone else who used mental attacks, it would come in handy. Mental Freeze, uncommon. Using mana and mental power, strengthen your mind and freeze out any unwanted foreign intrusion. Especially effective against subtle influences. Increases mental defense against mental manipulation and most psionic-based abilities. When I was trying to defend against the mental intrusions of the Mindbreaker, it was hard to use my law. Mental Walls, C. Didn't have an ice element in it that I could use the law to strengthen, which made it hard. The way around that was to imagine my mind like the earth of a frozen tundra. Similar to the way permafrost worked. Strengthening it so that nothing could penetrate the frozen exterior. It seemed to work as that mental picture influenced the skill's upgrade. Now it was something that I could easily bolster with my law without having to go through any mental leaps. While those three skills upgraded during the fight, there was one more that upgraded afterward. Having come after, the notification was separated from the rest due to the kill notifications between them. It came later, as I watched the last moments of my father. Righteous Fury, rare. Your body burns with a righteous fury as you dismantle your enemies. Temporarily increase the effect of all stats by 22.5% at the cost of increased stamina consumption. Once the effect wears off, your body enters a state of weakness based on the duration of the boost. It was bittersweet that it upgraded at a time like that, but I would take all the boost I could get. Upgrading to rare increased the boost of the skill from 15% to 22.5%. I hadn't had a chance to test it yet, but it seemed to be a boost in strength that was always welcomed. That was the end of the notifications, though. 4 skill upgrades, a law upgrade, and countless kill confirmations. All told, the fight was a massive boost. If only it didn't come with the cost it had. For the wave that was coming in a few hours, I wasn't that pressed. I had to spend some of my newly acquired points to purchase yet another Ice Mana Stone, but that was worth it. My new profession skill increased the effectiveness of the ward. With all the newly gained strength I just received, the wave would be fine. It was other things that I was planning for. Now that my class was maxed out, my profession would get some attention that it had been missing. My profession was a great deal behind my class, and it didn't have the achievements for the evolution that my class did. I hadn't had the time to do much with it with all the fighting. In the last 15 levels, I needed to make something impressive to increase my chance of getting a rare profession. Information on professions was easier to come across, and I knew what was required of me to unlock the one I wanted. Upgrading from Runic Blacksmith to Runesmith wasn't that rare, and there were a few books out there that detailed the process and the list of requirements that were needed. Before that, though, was a different thing that would occupy my time. I felt close to forming my spirit anchor during the fight, and I didn't want to let that feeling slip away. I could feel that I was close, and I would be spending the next few days trying to figure it out. My status looked a lot better with the new upgrades. Name, Christopher Zelensky. Race, F, Human. Class, F, Champion of Nibelheim. Rare, level 50. Profession, F. Runic blacksmith. Uncommon, level 35. Finity, ice. Faction, Zelensky family. Temporary, faction head. Strength, 398. Agility, 203. Perception, 96. Fortitude, 344. Endurance, 162. Vitality, 135. Intelligence, 67. Wisdom, 150. Acumen, 56. Free points, 0. Laws, lesser law of ice. Class skills, boiler. Profession skills, boiler. Coins, 0. Points, 1,432,876. Chapter 108. I'm still here. With my newly upgraded law, there wasn't a lot I had to do before the wave arrived. I could have scrambled around putting last-minute preparations up, but I didn't feel the need. I was stronger now than ever, and the wave wouldn't be that hard compared to yesterday's fight. The only one I really had to be wary of was the last wave. This wave, the 27th, would have the first E-ranked boss, but even that wouldn't be a first for me. It would be different in that it was an E-ranked beast this time instead of a human, but I didn't think it would be that different of an outcome. This wave would have lesser monsters at level 44 and 45, with the 4 mini-bosses at level 47, all topped off with a boss at level 50. Only one E-rank didn't seem that bad. It was when every monster was in the E-rank that there would be a problem, but I had just over a week to figure out how to deal with that. I hoped to have my spirit anchor by then. Speaking of spirit anchors, that was how I spent my time before the wave arrived. Meditation had never come easily to me, and doing it in the cold only made it marginally better. The cold made it easier to relax and get into the right state of mind for the process, but upgrading my meditation skill also helped. It had a more pronounced effect now that it was upgraded, which I hadn't noticed before. I had always used the skill as a self-heal to speed up my recovery, but it was so much more than that. It helped keep me in the right state of mind without letting outside things distract me. It did nothing for my chaotic thoughts, but I would take every bit of help I could get. After trading for and buying all the information about spirit anchors that I could get, it revealed that they were most commonly formed during meditative bursts of insight. It was one such meditative burst of insight I was trying, and failing, to induce. They typically formed from deep dives of introspection and were caused by insights gained during meditation. A concept that was completely foreign to me and wasn't going so well. My bouts of meditation before didn't go well either, but this was something that I would have to get better at. Meditation was how people broke through into higher-tiered laws and gained insights into their spirits and a bunch of other things. It was the basis on which most people built their power base. Meditation wasn't a necessary part of the process of enlightenment, but it was by far the most common. It was also the safest. Attempting to gain insights during battle was a good way to die young. A lot of things could go wrong during a battle that could cause your early demise, especially when it was a particularly difficult battle where most breakthroughs occurred. The fact that Jonathan got lucky during his wasn't lost on me. It was something that I desperately wanted for myself, yet also was something that I couldn't rush. Every time I tried to push it, it felt like it edged further from my grasp. My musings weren't aimless, but they also weren't concrete. I was trying to feel out different anchors that I could possibly use. The options were near endless, though, which made everything harder. They could be an object, an idea, a phrase, or pretty much anything. Phrases were the most common, but that didn't mean that mine would be one. I tried using a bunch of things as my anchor, but nothing felt right. Ice, my hammer, the armor I made. Everything that was currently in my possession. Nothing felt right. I also didn't really know what I was looking for and was mostly going with the idea I would know when I felt it. Another thing that I was assuming about this whole process. The only thing I had to go off of was the only 2 times I felt anything close to forming one. It happened once after the fight with the Vine Bears, and it happened again during the fight with the Mindbreaker. Neither time was clear enough to gain a better picture of what I was supposed to do. It made me jealous that Jonathan had already formed his. Jealous that he knew who he was while I was left to grasp at straws in the dark. Frustration was easy when it didn't feel like I was making progress, and it was hard to keep the feeling at bay. Juggling, trying to make progress without trying to rush. It was a thin line that I was attempting to walk down like a tightrope between skyscrapers. I was lucky that a chime signaled my stress relief would be arriving soon. If anyone told the monsters that they had been relegated to such a role, they would surely spit blood. Not like any of that mattered in the long run. They wouldn't live long enough to figure it out. While the fight was cathartic and a much-needed reprieve from the hours spent fumbling about, it didn't work to get me any closer to my goal. The only thing it did was cover me in blood that I had to wash off. It certainly raked in the points, but wasn't the inspiration I was hoping for. It seemed this would take longer than I thought. I was about ready to throw a fit after 2 days passed. I knew this was supposed to be hard, but this was borderline obscene. After the days of meditation, I had gotten better at feeling it out. My sense of what was the right track versus the wrong one grew the longer I spent contemplating it. I had narrowed it down somewhat, but that was about it. For the anchor itself, it felt like a phrase was the best bet. No object or concept had the same feeling that a phrase gave off. Narrowing it down further than that was what had taken so long. There were countless phrases and millions of combinations of words that I could use. While it helped to know the direction to go in, knowing it was a phrase helped only a little. Still, I got better. First, if you don't succeed, try again, or some shit like that. The information from the store said you could force a spirit to accept an anchor, but doing so was a good way to cripple your potential. Phrases or objects that were close enough and gave off a resonance of sorts could be forced into submission. It resulted in a weaker spirit anchor than forming one naturally, but some were content with good enough. The anchor was the base that all future spirit powers were built on top of. If the anchor wasn't the best it could be, the future powers built atop it wouldn't be the best they could be either. Permanently weakening myself wasn't something I was after. It was building on a faulty foundation, and it could lead to catastrophic effects. Still, people who clawed for more power and were stuck at their rank because they didn't have an anchor would gladly force one if given the chance. The farther away the anchor was from what it naturally would have been, the weaker it would be and the more it would affect your future. There were even experiments detailing how a god tried to force one on a lower-tiered servant just to see if it was possible. It was not. That experiment ended violently and explosively. To reach higher ranks, more than one path of power was needed, and if someone crippled their spiritual futures with a forced anchor, they would be forced to rely on the other two and be forever barred from godhood. It wasn't clear what the requirements were for godhood, but the information said a forced spirit anchor would forever bar you from it. Forcing it wasn't my intended goal anyway, so I paid that information little heed. I still had time to figure it out without resorting to such lengths, but I did plan on using it as a guiding light. If it felt like it could be forced, then I was on the right track and I was close. With it being a phrase, I parsed out things I thought it could be. I knew what Jonathan's was, and I was basing my thoughts on that. His was pretty cool, honestly. "You have to go through me first" was a dope line to be your anchor. If mine turned out to be something stupid, I would never tell anyone what it was. Especially Austin. Trying to feel out different phrases was both annoying and fruitless. It literally could have been anything, and I had no idea where to start other than random ideas that came to mind. I tried using hammer in the phrase, something about my family, even something about honor, even though I knew it wouldn't work. Honor wasn't who I was. It was an ideal I wanted to uphold. Jonathan was a protector, so his phrase was related to that. Finding out who I was still hadn't revealed anything noteworthy. I was a warrior, a leader, somewhat. Even trying to use something about my bloodline didn't work. I fought like a frost giant in theory, but nothing about them felt right. It wasn't who I was. To mix it up and spend some time meditating in a new environment to get ideas, something finally hit close to the mark. I mostly stayed in the camp where it was coldest during my meditations, up on the crow's nest for the best view. It was both relaxing from the cold and scenic from the height. Not knowing what would spark inspiration, I went where it felt right, and that was overlooking the area at the top of the crow's nest. Still, it got old sitting there for a few days, and I had ventured out to a few different spots. I ran over to the mountain for a bit and a few other places. I even tried meditating on it while fighting a fallen pylon nearby. It wasn't a dangerous fight, and I had tried to use the relatively safe battle to spark something. Most of my enlightenments had come from battle, and that was an idea I tried to pursue. The place that had brought me closest to the answer was the cemetery on the hill adjacent to the camp we had built. I didn't visit it much before now because I had been too busy trying to gain strength. Now that I was spending time outside of combat, I visited a lot more. Also because it was where my father was. He was the one I would usually turn to with something like this. He always knew the right thing to say to get me on the right track. If he were still here, he would have been able to point me in the right direction. Trying to talk it out with the headstones was what I had turned to. Obviously, they wouldn't answer, but it helped to voice my thoughts out loud to hear them verbalized. It was slightly depressing to do for long periods of time, but it was also a way to grieve. As I looked over the 13 headstones, a sense of sadness was hard to ignore. It was hard to not feel defeated looking at them, to feel that I had failed somehow. I knew that it wasn't my fault and those feelings were baseless, but that didn't mean they didn't exist. It was hard to get the rational side of my mind to get rid of the pesky emotional side's thoughts. It was in one of my darker thoughts that something sparked. Playing with different phrases led me down a rabbit hole. Starting with one would lead to another, leading to another, and soon you were nowhere close to the phrase you started with. Sitting in front of the people who were no longer here with us, a new phrase came about. I'm still here. Saying it brought about the feeling I was aiming for. At the core of my being, power reacted to the phrase I had muttered. It wasn't perfect and I could have forced it, but I didn't want to do that. Saying it over and over wasn't helpful. I knew it wasn't the phrase I was going for, but it was close to the real one. Still, I couldn't get it out of my head. I'm still here. Was it some twisted sense of survivor's guilt that made it close, or was I focusing on the wrong thing? The feeling said it was close, but it didn't specify what about the phrase was close. For all I knew, it could have been the number of words or something else silly like that. I doubted it, but I also didn't have enough to go on to say any differently. It certainly didn't feel like it was how I viewed myself. It sounded too defeatist for my tastes, like someone who had given up. I knew for a fact that wasn't who I was. It was a clue, though, and one I would use. It was coming up on 3 days of trying to figure it out, and it finally felt like I was making progress. I'm still here. Chapter 109 Warrior. Day 82. Before the wave started at noon, I needed to take a break. I had been at this for more than a few days and my mind was tired. A migraine was on the verge of forming and my stomach was rumbling. Some rest and recuperation were in order, as was a nice meal. My cooking wasn't the best in the world, but living on my own for the last half a dozen years forced me to get better at it. I was no Michelin star chef, but I could get by, especially for my own taste buds. I had to buy more cooking utensils since the ones we had were taken down south, but that wasn't a huge deal. They were minuscule in price and I had the points to spare. Spices, oils, seasonings, the whole 9 yards. It all added up to a few hundred points, but that was nothing. A single beast gave more than that. Campfire cooking was an art that I didn't have a lot of experience with, but the ability to throw as much wood as I wanted on the fire while controlling the temperature with my ice was a cheat I used to my advantage. No matter how much fuel the fire had, it would never get hotter than I let it, which was great for keeping a steady temperature. It wasn't a standard grill or anything, but it got the job done. The food was average. It wasn't great, but it wasn't bad. I had noticed as I increased in levels and stats, normal food didn't taste the same. It took more of it to fill me up and lacked the flavor it once had. I wasn't certain, but I thought it had to do with the level of the meat. If the meat came from a high-level beast, then it tasted better than meat from a lower-level beast. Probably had something to do with the amount of essence, but I wasn't too concerned with it. That sounded like something a chef or cook would worry about. I hadn't prepared any high-level meat, but I should have. During my break, my mind couldn't help but snap back to my phrase. I caught myself thinking about it even though I was specifically trying not to. It was nagging at my brain and I couldn't help but wonder about it. I'm still here. Other variations came about like, I remain, or something along the lines of steadfast and enduring. All of them caused the same feeling to varying degrees. Some had more of a reaction than others, but they all didn't feel right. Even though I wanted to take a break, I wasn't able to. My mind simply wouldn't let it go. It was like a popcorn kernel stuck between teeth. You couldn't help but poke at it. Even when your tongue and gums got sore, it was impossible to let go. I barely remembered to buy another mana stone for the rune to use before the wave. They ran out a few hours after the wave and I had to keep buying more every time, which was annoying. When the ding of the wave arriving sounded out, I was still no closer than before. It was with a moderate amount of frustration that I gripped my hammer for the wave. If the wood had been any lower in quality, it would have shattered from my clutch. As the monsters closed in, they had something different about them. They didn't act the same as usual animals, and they had a vulgar feeling emanating from them. They acted almost like they had rabies or something like that, completely rabid compared to normal. The monsters already had a higher amount of aggression, but these took it even further. Identify called them demonic leopards. What I was seeing visually didn't make me think of leopards. There was none of the feline grace nor the sleek killing form that cats usually had. There was a bulk to them that seemed unnatural. Their fur was all black with hints of red that made them look even worse. The streaks of red looked like veins of blood, which explained the accompanying scent of blood and copper. Like they had bathed in blood before the wave. It was unpleasant. I wasn't certain what affinity the leopards had, but if I had to guess, it would be blood and demonic or something along those lines. The fight started as normal, but it quickly turned feral. My hammer obliterated them every swing, but they fought differently than the normal monsters, causing me to change my style as well. This wasn't the fighting I was experienced with. Usually, during the waves, the monsters were highly aggressive and always went for the kill. They did everything they could to kill the defenders they were sent against. While it may result in injury, their main goal was to kill. These didn't. It was like they were okay with throwing away their lives for a small wound. While I was bringing my hammer down on one, another would leap not on my back, but my foot to cause a small wound. Their claws skittered off my armor most of the time, but their repeated attacks carved grooves in the ice over time. They focused on the same spots, which was alarming. Even the new ones that rushed in after the fact stuck to the same spots of attack. It was like all of them were given a template on where to attack. It was concerning because that template aligned with where my least defended spots were. Joints that I couldn't reinforce with armor underneath for mobility, tendons that would cripple if they got through, and flesh wounds compared to fatal ones. I got the feeling they were aiming to cripple, not kill. As their claws dug deeper, I started to worry slightly. Even though I was killing them at unprecedented speeds, some were still able to land attacks. It was impossible to kill them fast enough to remain unmolested. I could do it, but it would expend too much energy and mana to be sustainable. The alarm didn't stop there either. The beasts started to work together as well. One would go high while another would go low, forcing me to choose which to defend. None of the previous waves had this level of coordination. It didn't have the feeling like they were being directed like some of the previous waves, but like they were doing it themselves. Like they knew they were going to die and teamed up to land at least one attack before they did so. It was a startling display of lacking self-preservation. Monsters usually didn't have much self-preservation, but these seemed to have even less than normal. Claws worked through ice and drew blood for the first time during the fight almost an hour into it. I had been fighting the destruction of my armor the best I could, but they still managed to get through. I pushed my law into the areas they were targeting and tried my best to use ice manipulation to keep it intact, but I wasn't able to keep up. They were relentless. After blood was drawn, they went into even more of a frenzy. It was like a boost was applied and they all got stronger, faster. Another cut appeared on my skin and it happened again. The pattern repeated a few times and it became harder to fend them off. Frozen patchwork worked through my body to freeze over the bleeding cuts, but that didn't stop new ones from forming. As one cut froze over, two more were opened up. As the wounds closed, the boost the leopards got also lowered. It was like they got a boost for every open wound that I had. The new ability was something I wasn't used to, and it was hard to counter while in the middle of the fight. I had to come up with ideas while fighting as best I could. The fact they were pushing me was both surprising and nice. It showed that even though they weren't in the E rank, I could still get pushed by certain beasts. The last wave didn't carry with it the difficulty that I had come to like. The vine bears were a fight. It was a true battle in every sense of the word. The ants were as well. They could take some punishment and dish it out themselves. The 27th wave couldn't. The beasts were some form of dog that wasn't one I knew, and they didn't hold up very well to either hammer or cold. It was almost disappointing coming out of that fight mostly intact. I had just gone through a huge power boost with 4 skills and my law upgrading, but it wasn't the fight I had come to enjoy. This was a fight. It was a different kind of fight, but a fight nonetheless. They weren't the massive bears that could push me around, nor the metal ants that could take a few hammer blows, but they were putting up a resistance. An annoying resistance, but it was enough to feel the pressure, the thrill of battle. That heat wasn't just imaginary anymore either. Previously, I had equated it to battle fever. The feeling I got while in battle was a rush that I couldn't get anywhere else. I had thought that it was all just in my head, but that didn't turn out to be true. All of my meditation over the past few days made me more in tune with what I was feeling within my body. I had been monitoring minute changes while trying to suss out my phrase, and that carried over well to other feelings. The battle fever was an actual feeling deep inside me, near where the spirit anchor resided. Near where the fluctuations I had been keeping a close eye on. They weren't the same, but they were related somehow. With this new information, I went in a different direction with my anchor. If how I felt while in battle resonated with it, then I would try using it. I didn't make a phrase out of it, but stuck with the base idea of battle. Of a good fight with a worthy foe. The idea sparked the same reaction as the phrases I had been playing with did. A churning that was near, but not exactly what I was looking for. It was another clue in the right direction. I knew that "I'm still here" sounded too defeatist to be right, and this proved it. If the idea of battle was close, then it was something that touched on both of those aspects. Phrases still felt better than ideas, but I continued trying to find the right idea. If I could narrow down that, it would make figuring out the phrase easier. While smashing and crumpling the leopards throwing themselves at me, my mind pointed inward. More wounds appeared due to that, which only made it harder, but it was the needed pressure that I wanted. The fight with the pylon had been too easy to use for inspiration, and this wave was making up for that. Every dead body that littered the area, every body that I stood over to continue the fight, helped narrow it further. I felt it building up inside me. It was asking to be realized, to finally be let free. It wanted to be formed just as much as I wanted it to. What Jonathan described as a feeling growing from his core was exactly what I was feeling now. The power carried with it a question. It was asking who I was. For the longest time, that very question had stumped me. I had been looking in the wrong spot to come up with the answer. I was a leader, yes, but that wasn't who I was. It was a temporary title that I had, and I didn't even think I was that good of a leader yet. Survivor and fighter were both wrong answers as well. While I was both, it wasn't what the power was looking for. There were other answers to that question that I had come up with, but they felt so futile now. Now that I was being asked, those felt lesser somehow. My mind tried to paint me in a different light, and that light was falling away now. There were none of the noble or righteous things I colored my vision of myself with. Only the bare truth was left, and I could see that clearly now. I was in the midst of battle with hundreds of enemies who wanted me dead, who threw their lives away to leave but a scratch on my form. I stood alone against hundreds and reveled in it. It didn't matter if I was anything else. It didn't matter what other word I came up with to describe who I was. There was only one that mattered right now. Only one encompassed all that I needed it to. Warrior. I was a warrior. In every sense of the word. My idea of a warrior probably didn't match everyone's, but that wasn't what mattered. It was asking how I saw myself, and that was entirely subjective. A warrior of old. Of the ones in stories. The idealistic version that was probably never really what a warrior was. None of that mattered. It was the answer that it was looking for. Now that who I was had an answer, the power moved on to needing something else. It needed the phrase that it would anchor itself to. "I'm still here" could have worked, but I knew what was wrong with it now. The idea of battle could have also worked, but it was wrong for similar reasons. Battle wasn't what anchored me. It wasn't the idea that I resonated with. Neither was the fact I was still here while others weren't. It took me most of the fight to realize it, but it was obvious now that I had. In a fight, there would only be one winner. There would be the victor and the defeated. One would live on while the other died. One would be forgotten, and one would be left standing. It was so similar to "I'm still here" that I was surprised I hadn't thought of it. It was so close that it should have been easy. My hammer had reaped lives and cut journeys short, their strength of arms failing to be enough to bring me low. It didn't matter how else the fight went, or how injured or wounded I ended up. If I was still upright at the end, I won. There was only a slight change that was needed, a small tweak to make it right. It wasn't the fact that I was still here. It was the fact I waited over the bodies of the fallen and stood over their corpses. My power exploded and I felt my hammer light up with energy. It misted anything that it hit with an ease I hadn't felt in a long while. The leopards' bodies couldn't hold up anymore. My spirit flowed around me into my armor, my hammer, my ice, everything I used to conduct the battle. Everything I needed it to. They carried with them a piece of me which empowered them like nothing else had. Where chunks of ice used to break, they held firm. Where my armor used to fail and crack, it weathered anything thrown at it. My phrase was anchored and formed, and it would not fail me. It was who I was. I'm still standing. Chapter 110. Full aggression. Manipulating my spirit was almost intuitive. It flowed where I willed it and responded similarly to ice manipulation, I could feel it flow through my hammer, strengthening it to an unprecedented degree. It had a reliable feel to it that made me trust it with my full strength. Even with avalanche at full blast, fury glacial presence and my bloodline all boosting my stats, it felt like my hammer wouldn't break. It was a much-needed addition. After my law upgraded, I didn't have to be ginger with the weapon, but I still didn't trust it at full blast. My strength was monstrous and it would only go up, and now it felt like my hammer could handle it and then some. Having another thing to strengthen my hammer was nice. Instead of having to chase higher tiers of ice laws to keep up, my anchor was enough. It did make me slightly sad that it wouldn't break. I was almost planning on it to happen eventually and already had plans on what to make next. Different designs and tweaks from what I had already made. The ice was still malleable to a point, but it wouldn't take huge changes without having to redo it entirely. After my law upgraded, remaking my hammer wasn't necessary. All I had to do was saturate it in the higher-tiered law for a few hours to strengthen the weapon. As I grew more experienced with runes and the like, I wanted to try and incorporate it into the structure of the weapon. Having the control over ice that I did, it gave me almost limitless possibilities with rune incorporation. I could forge runes into the crystalline structure itself instead of having to carve them after the fact like with metal. If I could size them right and combine them, a durability rune on the hammerhead and a piercing rune on the spike would greatly increase the deadliness of the weapon. Other runes and ideas bounced around in my head, but those two were the main ones. The only reason I hadn't done so yet was I didn't know where to start. Now that I had my anchor, that was the next thing I was going to spend my time on. The demonic leopard's attacks went from drawing blood to not even coming close. The ice remained unmarred from their claws after my spirit strengthened washed through it. It took away the consequences of using full aggression and all offense. The death toll skyrocketed after that. My hammer whizzed around at speeds that were a blur to base human eyes, deforming everything it hit. More than 3 bodies were flattened with every swing since they were packed in so tight trying to maul me. I didn't even have to use the environment or a whirlwind of ice anymore to help with killing them. My hammer was enough and my armor kept everything at bay. Dropping the attention I kept on ice manipulation let me focus fully on the grand melee, and it was marvelous. Ha ha ha. Laughter boomed out of me, almost jolly even. The pressure from the battle was entirely gone now that I got a boost in power, but that didn't mean I wasn't having fun of a different kind. Pure destruction had an enjoyment of its own, especially after everything that had happened. The ability to utterly ignore attacks while maintaining wide sweeps with my hammer. Even after the lesser monsters ended and the mini-bosses charged in, I didn't change my tactic. Using magic was overkill by this point. I wanted to see how far I could push my physical abilities. The lesser monsters didn't even require me to use Mighty Blow, or the upgraded Frostbite, Pervading Cold, They simply couldn't handle the force I was swinging my hammer with. Dying to mundane mass times acceleration. The mini-bosses were sturdier, not yet E rank, but bulkier and stronger than their lesser counterparts. They looked like they could handle a swing or two without my skills. I wanted to see if I could kill them with one. Loading both skills onto my hammer came easier than ever, my spirit empowering it and facilitating the mana flow better than before. Charging up Mighty Blow as much as it could go, I brought the weapon down on the leading leopard boss. Pervading Cold didn't even get a chance to apply. The damage was so great. The head of the beast just disappeared, spraying chunks of skull and brain matter on the ground below it. Any other beast that would have watched a member of its kind get killed in such an overwhelming fashion would have fled as fast as it could with its tail between its legs. It was a good thing that these weren't normal beasts. It would have been a pain to chase them. The others held up just as well as the first had, which was not at all. In no time flat, the 4 enlarged bodies joined with the countless smaller ones sans their heads. Something unfortunate had happened to those. The boss tried to growl and roar its challenge, but it lacked the threat to make it a real challenge. It didn't have the gravitas that the vine bear had and was almost worth pitying if the creature wasn't so ugly. Its unpleasantness was greater than just its looks. The tang of blood that wafted off of it was stronger than all the rest, and it had an even stronger unnatural feeling. It only made me want to kill it faster. The boss was an E-ranked beast at level 52, and it had a huge bump in strength crossing the rank gap, but it had nothing else going for it. It didn't have a lesser law, only at least it didn't have a spirit anchor, and the only thing it had was a durable body and high stats. A durable body and high stats that I could almost match. From my boosts and bloodline, I had a higher strength than it, but its other stats still dwarfed mine. Strength and fortitude were the only two that I would say I had the advantage. That was fine. It wouldn't change the outcome. Instead of trying to brain it with my hammer, I tried something else. My spirit could do a lot for me during battle, and I wanted to experiment to test the limits. I already proved it could strengthen my hammer, making it stronger and faster than before. It greatly increased the durability of frost armor and the chunks of ice I used as weapons. Now I wanted to see the extent of what it could do. Ice fell off me in pieces as frost armor fell away. This next test was what it would do to my body. I knew what it could do to my ice, and from Jonathan I knew what it would do to equipment. It was somewhat risky to try, but I felt confident. My spirit flowed through me just like it had with everything else. I could feel the potential that it carried with it in every part of my body. It wasn't a stat boost per se, but an improvement of a different kind. Like the base material could handle more and take more punishment. Strength without enough fortitude would result in muscle tears and bone fractures if a person wasn't careful. The body had more strength than it could handle. I didn't have that problem, but it felt like this would alleviate it if I did. Like it hardened my body past what it was supposed to go. Not quite a boost in strength, but durability. I was uncertain if all spirit anchors were like this or if it was specific to just the ones I knew. Jonathan's was all about defending, and he could use it on his body, shields, and his earth. Mine was similar. I could use it on my body, weapon, and ice. I'm still standing implied the sustainability to do so. To weather a battle and come out the other side, a person needed to be durable. If I went with a different phrase, could I have increased my strength? Even with all the information we had, there was still a lot we needed to figure out. The boost was big, but it wasn't enough to stop the boss's claws outright. They sliced into me through the spirit empowerment. I had to be careful not to let it cause any lasting damage. Losing a limb because of carelessness wasn't what I had in mind, which made me switch my tactic quickly after it proved ineffective. The next thing I tried was using reinforced body as well as what I did before. The skill felt more powerful than before, and it had an increased effect to go along with it. It still wasn't enough to negate the damage from the claws, though. The uncommon skill with my spirit alone wasn't enough. With those tests satisfied, I moved on to the last one I wanted to do. It was something I had done in the heat of the moment before, and I wanted to explore more of what I could do with it. During the fight with the Blaze Lion, I grabbed hold of it and channeled Frostbite into it through sustained touch. It wasn't how the skill was intended to be used, but Pervading Cold changed that. It wasn't as strict on usage as Frostbite was, and I wanted to test out what it could do. Grabbing hold of the boss was easy, All I had to do was let it hit me and jump on it after it closed in. Turning frost armor R back on gave me the leeway to be a bit reckless like this. Keeping hold of the beast was another matter. It did not like that I was latched onto it. It went into a frenzy trying to get me off, bucking wild and frantically. I used ice to anchor myself to it and help keep hold of it. After securing myself, I activated the skill. Without the restriction of being used on a weapon, ice mana flowed into the boss from where I held on. I leveraged ice manipulation and my law the best I could, trying to freeze the beast through. It fought me. A sanguine red mana fought against my intruding ice, but it couldn't put up a fight. The fire from the blaze lion was harder to vanquish than the bloody mana this thing used. I wasn't sure what kind of mutation the beast had that led to its affinity being like this, but it wasn't just blood anymore. It carried something else with it. Whatever the mutation was, it didn't affect the outcome. The base of its power was blood, and blood could freeze. It was a losing battle from the start. All of the mana I had saved from not using skills or magic came in handy now because I didn't think I would have been able to kill it with any less. While the beast couldn't fight off the pervading cold as well as the blaze lion, it was harder to freeze. It was harder to corrupt and took more mana due to its rank. Taking more mana didn't mean I wasn't able to, it just took longer. I poured mana into the skill and watched as it pervaded the beast, reaching deeper and deeper in. The bucking gradually slowed until it stilled completely. Couldn't move anymore, frozen still. Took all of my mana and left me deeply exhausted. But I did it. The body of the frosty leopard remained upright, was in pristine condition, only with a bit of ice and frost covering its form. After 28 waves and 82 days, I now had a spirit anchor. Multiple days of meditation finally paid off. End of chapter 110.